right, Tim. So, as we start the conversation today, let's learn a little bit more about the work that you're currently doing. I know you and your team are focused on helping business leaders prepare their supply chains to meet some of the global challenges that we will talk about today. But first things first, you've also walked in their shoes in the past. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you bring that into your work today?
Okay, so my background is a lengthy one, as you can probably tell. So I spent most of my life in manufacturing industry, predominantly in the UK. So my heritage is around lean manufacturing, I guess as a principle, but as a cultural and philosophic thing, as rather than just tools and techniques. And for the last 25 years, I've been in consultancy in two businesses. The latter one, Iter, is my own, and have helped a numbers of organizations, not just with lean manufacturing, but much more with supply chain strategy and supply chain execution within that. So, yeah. So and our ethos, the core value of Iter is never design a strategy you wouldn't be prepared to implement and operate yourself. So kind of what we do is we don't just give advice, we help clients take that journey and support them all the way, or as much as they wish to be. So I think it says something about the solutions you design, but also the kind of people you need in order to be able to do that. And all our team is from senior operational positions coming into consultancy later in their working lives when I guess the ego has been squashed and it's about giving back as much as anything else.
But I do think that's an important thing to acknowledge. You know, you talk about never making a recommendation or helping formulate a strategy that you wouldn't have been willing to execute on yourself. I think that's certainly there's the knowledge and experience that comes with having a background in the space that you currently consult in, but sort of keeping that, I don't even know that it's a moral rudder, but sort of keeping that, no, yes, I'm helping this person, but I have to always remember what they will be dealing with on the other side of this decision-making process. Now, are there specific industries where you focus or geographies or market segments that we're likely to hear about as you and I talk through some of the work that you're doing today?
I think our core market tends to be engineering type businesses. We tend to get used on really complex supply chain issues because for all the reasons I've just talked about. We're a British business, but our clients tend to be larger global businesses. So whilst we're based in the UK, we'll work around the world. It's true to say the majority of our work is in Europe, but I've been to the States several times in the last few years helping clients on various bits and pieces.
And regardless of where a supply chain ends, we know in both directions it's likely reaching global. And I think that reality, plus the fact that you talked about the complexity of the supply chains that you're working with, I'm sure that's part of why you focus so heavily on modeling. Can you talk a little bit about the power of modeling as a technique to help decision-making teams better see, I guess, if we're being sort of figurative, but also to understand their current supply chain before they try to change it?
I think it's fair to say most organizations don't really understand the depths of their supply chain. They'll understand the bits they're familiar with, but having a complete picture is really quite difficult and quite challenging. And I think models do one of two things. One, they put that whole picture together, but quite often it debunks some of the myths exactly, but it debunks some of the fallacies that exist. I'll give you a quick example. We're working with it's actually a Swedish multinational organization. It's about a facility that happens to be in the UK where most of its market, which is its internal customers, is in Asia, and then Europe is a poor third behind the US as well. Not surprisingly, when there was a plan to redevelop the whole site because it needs redeveloping, the question was, well, why should it stay in Europe? And one of the big issues was, well, the freight costs. One of the things that would stop it moving out of Europe were freight costs were huge. when you did the modeling, it was a tiny proportion of the overall cost. Now, that's not touching the ecological impacts or anything like that, but on a pure economic basis, because most of their model was big, heavy stuff. And this was really quite high value and small. When you actually put that reality, then it actually wasn't. And the benefits were on, what you could buy in what part of the world made the economic case much more strongly than the logistics.
Do you find that's a common challenge, that companies are looking at their supply chain, always looking to increase efficiency, right? Typically looking to become more sustainable or environmentally responsible, but of course, always want to be more cost effective. Do you find that separating out those logistics costs versus material fabrication component costs is a common challenge?
Yeah, I think it is. I think I think quite often we see organizations that try and achieve both the cost and the ecological benefits, but are doing it a very tactical way. So it's very, it's almost like death by a thousand cuts. So they're trying to cut a bit here, cut a bit there, cut a bit everywhere, rather than having this strategic view. I personally believe that there's a real strong alignment between economics and ecologics, and some of that is in product design, some of that is in packaging design, but a big chunk of it is on your supply chain design as well. It's about what you do, where, and why. And I think there is a whole mass of factors. If we look back over the last, 4 or 5 years, if you think of the disruption to global supply chains from the pandemic, the huge hike in freight costs that occurred post-pandemic, global shortages, particularly around the electronics industry, extended lead time, certainly from a European perspective, the extended lead time from Asian supply. Then you've got Ukraine and Russia. Europe is being affected badly now by what was going on in the Middle East, because all the ships are having to go a much longer route to get to Europe. Yeah, and then we've got the oncoming presidency of Trump in the US, and no political statement, but it's going to bring uncertainty. I think the only thing we care about is our supply chains are not going to look like they do today in 4 years' time. They're going to be hugely different, and I think that's really fascinating. If you put the holistic cap on, and if you look at it from the whole business environment, including the environmental as well as anything, then I think there's some real significant opportunities, but huge risks. And I think the organizations that are good today get their heads around really strategically understanding what their supply chain is like, and where the bits of the jigsaw puzzle need to be in order to make the best picture. They are going to move yet further ahead of their competitors, their less agile competitors. So I'm strongly of the belief we're past peak globalization, that we're going to go into more regional distributed manufacturing models, which has huge impacts on manufacturing, but also on logistics and on the global footprint.
And I do think taking that holistic look is not just an interesting opportunity for aspirational supply chain leaders, but it is an opportunity to keep the supply chain in front of the C-suite. We've certainly had a few years, whether it was due to those shipping costs that you talked about, product shortages, but simply some of the complexity, right? As soon as you see ships start being attacked in the Red Sea, we can't use the Suez Canal, everything is rerouted. There's no denying that the supply chain is going to be right at the top of the CEO's list, probably the CFO as well, but helping take that opportunity to change the way they not only see but think about the supply chain. As teams are going through these mapping exercises, I'm sure there are internal benefits and things that they want to talk about and learn about and consider about their supply chain. How do they then connect that to overall business objectives? I guess both in terms of the impact that the supply chain can have, but also in terms of the language that they use to talk about that impact, just to help us keep this opportunity of attention.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to talk in the language of the C-suite. And supply chain and operations, they're pretty technical subjects, or can be pretty technical product subjects. They tend to be run by people that are technically very competent. But the C-suite want to talk about costs. They want to talk about working capital. They want to talk about resilience, time to market, the things that actually move the needle. And I think that's the languages to be at the C-suite you've got to use. I think the danger is we get lost in the complexity of what we're trying to do, because unquestionably, if we start to go from we buy everything in the Far East and we move it into the US, Europe, wherever it is, it's not easy, but it's a simple model.
Yeah.
When you've got some of it being made in Asia, some of it being made in Europe, some of it being made in North America, and you're supplying global markets, you've got issues of consistency. How do you plan that supply chain for a start? That's a much, much more complex activity. Yeah, you will potentially more work in progress, but that's counterbalanced by you've got less logistics, you've got quicker responsiveness to the market. These are very fluid and different things. And we are fortunate that alongside these challenges, the technology has emerged to allow us to address those. But it needs a number of really key things to be in place, not least of which is quality of data. No longer can you rely on individuals' knowledge, because it just doesn't work in a globalized way. So I think it has pretty profound implications, but we have to position the supply chain as how it adds value, not just how it's a cost to be minimized. And I think we did that in the pandemic, but I think it's clear that we have moved back some way from that.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with you about that. And it's interesting because I'm not necessarily suggesting anyone would do this on purpose, but you can see where natural human response, you have a big meeting with a very executive level audience. In a way, the more complicated you can make something sound, the more intelligent you are, the more vital you are to answer, right? So not necessarily fluffing oneself up on purpose to try to sound more important, but even just in trying to sound like you know what you're talking about. I think it's a natural tendency that, I'm going to use some of those 25-cent words in this conversation, when in fact, the opposite is actually what would get us to what we want. And you're never going to make something as complex as modern global supply chains simple, but we could potentially communicate the options in simpler, more straightforward terms, or the impact on the business in simpler, more straightforward terms.
Yeah.
Is that something that in your work around modeling and advising and strategy development, do you sense that tendency, or do you find that whether the business has stayed with the idea of supply chain being front and center, supply chain leaders have walked away from the experience of the last few years? No, just go into the meeting and say what's happening and say what the options are and keep it very straightforward. Where are we from a communication standpoint?
I think having supply chain leaders being thrust into the C-suite and being an important part of that where they haven't been before, that's quite a big ask. And I suspect there is, from my experience, I would see there's quite often a lack of talent to be able to do that. Certainly there's a lack of people that view supply chain from a business perspective rather than from the technical perspective. Our team is made up from senior people from corporate life, and we put huge efforts to make sure what we're communicating is simple and clear and in the language of business, not in the technical language. And I think that's the way you have to do it. You've got to say option A is lower cost, but actually is not as responsive. And these are the risks you run by having that. Or you can do this, and there's a pros and cons. There's inevitably a recommendation, but at the end of the day, each business has to make its own judgment. And I think the other realization is that each business doesn't operate a supply chain. It has multiple supply chains within the factory, which is another dimension. And we just got to strip that simplicity, that complexity out and put it into simple language. It has to be in the language that people can buy into. Otherwise, you get into all kinds of technical discussions, and you're asking people to commit time, effort, and money to things that they kind of lost track of what they're really signing up for.
Yeah. No,
That's our
absolutely.
failing, not that's our failing, not theirs.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's no matter what we're talking about, it's always the people that things come back to, right? And so I think all of those communication patterns are interesting, that you can have the best strategy in the world, but to your point, if people are sitting in a room and they're thinking, I'm confused why we're here. I'm confused what we're getting out of this. I'm confused what's at stake, right? There is a failing in that messaging. And there are incredibly important things that supply chains are not only trying to achieve, but that they're dealing with. And you touched on a couple of them early, both economy and ecology. If we can go back and talk about each of those for a minute, certainly one of the first things that comes to mind from an economic standpoint is the impact of inflation. There are plenty of reports about inflation, different levels globally, but we're touching a lot of different countries with our supply chains. How should supply chain decision makers take the information that they have about inflation, incorporate it into their plans and strategies?
I think we're going to go into that one of the consequences of lots of tariffs, because wherever tariffs start, they will be retaliations around the world, and therefore we'll have this world of tariffs, which will potentially do two things. It will drive different patterns of supply chain, but it will drive inflation into economies and potentially recessions and all kinds of bits and pieces. So I think what you have to do is you can't spin supply chains round on a pinhead. These are strategic, longer term decisions. So in any modeling exercise, and I think modeling is a key central part of this, is any modeling exercise, the critical bit is getting a model of the as-is that you actually believe and is validated as this is a reflection of your business. Because then as you apply scenarios to that, then you test it. So I think there are numbers of factors. There is the supply chain certainty. There is the level of tariffs that could be in place. So there's the level of inflation and actual business volume. And I think you need to apply each of those a range of scenarios and firstly to work out what it is that's really going to move the dial in your business. So the example I gave earlier, people thought it was logistics costs. Well, it isn't. It's tiny. The reality was, well, there's a lot of electronics in their products. Well, they're global prices, so it doesn't matter where you make it for that. It all came down to the fabrication. The cost of fabrication was the key thing. So I think really understanding what the drivers are is key. Working a range of scenarios and modeling the impacts, and then you're depending on the nature of what your business is, you are either looking to get to the lowest cost, accepting the risks you're taking, or you're trying to get to something that's resilient, recognizing that you probably maybe you don't need the lowest cost supply chain. And therefore that's where it's gone from being a pure cost. It's we enter a business judgment about, well, it's going to cost us a little bit more to do this, but in doing so, we build a lot more resilience. I think it's really interesting if we're looking down into the actual products, people looking for where their vulnerabilities are in there. Talking to someone just yesterday, and the reality is it might be a shared component that's 3 or 4 tiers down in your supply chain that you might think by having dual sourcing levels up, you're making a great advantage. But if you're still dependent on this one component that's kind of only comes from one place in the world, then you've got to have a strategy to deal with that. Now, you may have to fund a stock that's held of those components in one or both of those suppliers, or you just need to be clear where your risks are. So I think modeling helps you understand those risks. Scenario modeling then helps you work out what the implications if some of those come to reality. It's then a best judgment about what you're mitigating against, which risks you want to work for and what the range is. And really, therefore, your strategy comes from that, recognizing unless there is another major schism over the next 5-10 years, probably that's the shape that you need to be running for a considerable time. I think then it begs another big question, because as our supply chains get more complicated, you then have to say, well, how do we manage and control these? And that becomes just as important as the physical shape. So it's not just then about the physical location, but the control points and the control mechanisms. Another example, it's a little bit dated now, but working with an organization trying to build their global aftermarket supply chain, working out where the stock needed to sit for what purpose was a complex modeling exercise. We were talking of 36,000 parts in something like 80 plus locations around the world, and what's the strategy for that? But after time it became quite simple, but what became really clear is the only way you could control that effectively was having the control in the center. So you had one global control point, and then it was different levels of control as you got closer to the end market. So it changes the structure, it changes the system and planning and analytics needs that you do. So I think we end up with supply chains that are more intelligent, with greater technology, with a higher level of analytic expertise, sitting centrally, being able to really control something on a global basis. Sounds right, but I think that's the way you have to go forward.
But I think in explaining that, you actually sort of touch on the two big things we've talked about a couple of times today. One is the reality that supply chains are incredibly complex. And if you want to manage them in a sophisticated way, you have to have technical, analytical people that want to sort of dig into the granularity. At the same time, and Tim, I'm now envisioning this as like the big dramatic boardroom scene in the supply chain movie, where all of that work has been done so that one person can walk into the room and the board is seated around the table and put this almost unrecognizable component right down in the middle of the table. And everybody looks at it. And the supply chain manager says, all this complexity, all this work, all this money, all those miles, it comes down to that one part that we need being made by one or two companies. And you have to do all of that technical complex work, but at the same time understand, what does it really boil down to? And I bet in a lot of cases, you can't get there until you've done the mapping exercise and the strategy that goes with it. But in a lot of cases, it's that, what's this one metal thing I'm going to put on the table, or this plastic injection molded piece I'm going to put in the middle of the table? Your whole company, the entire top line, comes down to that. That's what we have to figure out. And we would connect with that.
Yeah, and there may be 20 or 30 of those. And probably if there's 20, 19 will never come to fruition, but you just don't know which one is going to become a reality. So in my mind, you have to have that kind of decision. And I think it's like all of these things, you think in complex ways to allow you to act simply. And I think that's the key. If we go to this aftermarket supply chain, it took us nearly 6 months to build all those. This is a few years ago, so the analytic tools weren't as accessible as they are now. So it would take less time now, but it would still take months to build and understand all of this movement and the flow and what it is. But the solution actually came out really simply. It was a really clear, simple solution, but you would never have got to that had you not done that analysis.
Right.
And I think it's about thinking complex ways that allows you to articulate powerful things very simply, and then your implementation becomes simple. I'm a really firm believer. The more you can understand and really think through things, the simpler the actual physical solution becomes.
No, I agree with you about that wholeheartedly. And I think the challenging thing is that takes time. It's, if you're just trying to, okay, I'm going to go through a spreadsheet and do something, or I'm going to move these boxes over there. But to take all of that complexity and have enough time to think it through that you can boil it down to the 1 or 19 or 20 components that the risk is concentrated among, and then you can put everyone's brain power around coming up with a strategy. I think finding or creating that time, given the pace of business and the number of things supply chains are dealing with. I mean, talk about simplifying the complex. It really comes down to our use of time and where we focus our more active thoughts.
Oh, yeah, that's true. And I think I know I'm sitting here as a consultant with my consultancy business, but I think that's where consultancy can be powerful. Yeah, I'm really clear that consultancy used well is one of two things. You either don't have the skill sets or you don't have the time, or both. So it doesn't have to be because someone's going to come. You're not coming with a silver bullet. You're coming with the time and the expertise and the experience to think through these problems where I'm not chasing the month-end number. I'm not chasing this order, that part. Yeah, that's not my job. Yeah, have sympathy for the people that are doing it, but it gives you, yeah, and I've been there and I've done it, and I'm glad I'm not there anymore. But it's having the time. So I think it's and then it's critical that the client you're working with trusts you, and you've got faith in them, and you're buying them into the solution. So I think the key is doing that, but not doing it to show the big reveal. Aren't I clever?
Yes.
It's very much about doing it with the client to allow them to stand up and say, aren't we clever? Or just to be a part of their team for a period. And I think that's a kind of strong ethos that works through our organization and how we help our clients.
Yeah. So we talked about the economy. The other thing I want to make sure we carve out some time for is talking about the environmental impact of our supply chains and what we can do to move the needle there. When the mapping work is undergoing and the strategy work begins, are there ways that you recommend teams start to think about the environmental impact of their supply chains right from the outset to make sure that that's sort of a conscious line of thought that runs through all of the strategy work, the analytical work, the decision-making work that they have to do?
The answer to that is yes. We would, at the beginning of any of these types of activities, we would have sessions with them right at the beginning. One is around just basic data. What data do you have? Don't you have? Or how good is it? And it's never as good as people think. The second one is, what are the parameters you're trying to drive? What is it you're really trying to achieve? And what are the scenarios you are going to consider and not consider, and what really drives you? We would always bring up the ecological piece, because in this modeling you can measure it. So you look at, well, what's the impact of it being shipborne versus going by air?
Yep.
You need to look at that in the round. It's not as simple as saying, well, ship is better than air, rail is probably better than ship. But it has a working capital implications. If you're working on an extended supply chain, then you have the inventory, how you buffer those lead times. There's the second bit there says, well, okay, so if you're closer to home, then you don't have those. So it's bringing all of those factors, but absolutely in doing this, then you should be looking at the implications of the environment in what you do, because it's as critical as kind of the costs, and will become increasingly so. And I think that, businesses, particularly where people are not buying just on price, then that is a key factor. And you see companies greenwash, and it's very obvious that's happening, but you do see some that take it very seriously. And we're working with one client. It will not sign off a business case for anything unless the environmental impact is presented and understood. So that it's as black and white as that.
If you think about companies like that leading organization that you're talking about, to the extent that you can generalize, what is it that puts a company or a supply chain at the head of the pack when it comes to their ability to manage emissions or any other form of environmental impact?
I think in many instances, it's those that are inherently very profitable businesses. So if you're selling into something that is profitable, then you have the financial space to be able to do that. I think it's if you're selling into markets where there is pressure from your customers to address those things. But I think it's a values-driven thing to some degree. And I see the characteristic I would say of the businesses that are taking it seriously are ones that have the core of their business under good control. Going back to before I was even a consultant, I said before the environmental issues were kind of key. The best organization I worked for, I was a supplier. I was the kind of the operations manager across the business, managing the complete supply chain. And we had a 99.7% on time in full delivery time. And I got involved in one customer order in 18 months, I think. Well, that gave me lots of time and space to think about how we could be better. And I think it's businesses that are really genuinely well run, that are genuinely have thought through their organization, have thought through all the things we've talked about. They are addressing those actively. They're busy, but they're busy focusing on how the business is better, not focusing on how do I get the number out today. And I think that it gives them space, and invariably businesses that are more profitable tend to have higher caliber people working for them, and are huge generalizations, but I probably offended half your listeners now, so I apologize for that.
No, everyone thinks they're part of one of those really well-run companies, so you're good. But talk about simplifying the complex. I mean, if just to really, really boil it down, what you're saying is when you're good at things, you're good at things. If it's a well-run company and all of the operational communications, cultural people pieces that go along with that, if you can be really good and hit your on time and full metrics, you're probably also going to be very effective around reducing emissions. And so getting to that point, getting anybody who's listening in who's not already in a state of perfection, not you personally, it's that other guy, I want to sort of get your thoughts around what you observe in your work across supply chains. You get this great opportunity to come in and look at someone's supply chain with fresh eyes. In doing that, are there any commonly held myths that you often have to debunk right off the bat in order to do the work that the mapping exercise will hopefully then lead to?
I think that's a really difficult question. So every set of circumstances is different. And we've worked with clients with very similar dynamics and very similar technical issues, and come up with quite different solutions because their culture and their objectives are different. So different things are driving them. I think my biggest criticism of people who work in operations and supply chain as a generalization is because it is something that's very physical. They think in physical ways. And I think it comes back to this, think complex, act simply. Otherwise you have to, if you think simply, you end up acting in very complex ways and reactionary ways. And I think the other bit is because the way organizations are structured, people focus a lot on optimizing their bit rather than optimizing the whole. So being suboptimal in one place to allow something that's much more important is key. I think my background is lean manufacturing, elimination of waste, and it kind of frustrates me. If we think about inventory, people think inventory is this evil. And I see many organizations that are just on this ideological journey to eliminate all inventory. Well, it's only an evil if it's the wrong stuff in the wrong place for no purpose. So I think, again, it's thinking about what you have. And I often use the analogy of inventory is like oil in an engine. So if you have too much, all you get is black smoke, and you foot down the road and nothing happens. If you have too little, then you end up with a graunching sound. You need the right amount in the right place to allow it to run smoothly. And that way, the day-to-day kind of takes care of itself. And I think people seem to also to think everything is the same, therefore has to go through in the same way. So we all have to do small batches of everything. Well, no, you don't. If something takes a big changeover, it's disruptive. You don't sell much of it, but it's predictable. Well, just put some stock in place. Just take it off the table. take the 80% away to allow you to focus on the 20% that's difficult. And it's that kind of thinking strategically about what you do that so few organizations I see do.
Yeah. And if we're going to think strategically, we need to be aware of some of the big factors that are going to impact our supply chains. Certainly, you've talked about the looming threat of tariffs. I think that's probably the number one thing anybody in supply chain anywhere is looking at, thinking about, dreaming of, talking about right now. We've talked a little bit about economies and shifts there. We've talked about global conflict and how that impacts supply chains through trade routes. What are some of the trends and changes that you're most intensely monitoring for how they're going to change either our businesses and supply chains or our approach to decision making over the next few years?
I think we've obviously been through this hugely volatile period, and I think we would be naive if we think that volatility isn't going to continue. Unfortunately, we're kind of, it feels like we're in an ever less secure, stable world. People will retract, so I think there will be a trend to pull things closer to home. There will be, the tariffs is one manifestation of it's mine and I want to keep it. So I think there will be that. I think there will be major disruptions to flow of logistics. I just think it's just going to be very volatile. I think if you could summarize it, what's the trend going to be in the future? It's going to be that it's going to be volatile. That's the trend.
And as we think about that volatility, what we want in response is resilience. But that's not going to mean the same thing. And it would certainly vary by mode of freight. It's going to vary by industry. But I also wonder if it's going to vary by geography. You're based in the UK. I'm here in the US. Are there major geographical differences that you observe, for instance, just between our two regions?
I wouldn't claim to be a US expert, so I can't really give you a great detail. I mean, Europe is a very complex market just because of the nature of all different countries and languages and customs rules. And I know it's a free area, but there's still lots of different things in different countries you have to do, which I guess translates roughly to state and in the US. I think the scale and size of the US dwarfs any individual country in Europe. I think that's a complexity. I don't see any huge differences. I think we're wrestling fundamentally with the same things. I think we're wrestling with complexity. We're wrestling with uncertainty. We're wrestling with the combined pressures of an ever more complex supply chain, price pressures, but no let up in the expectation of service from customers. I mean, one of the other key areas that we get involved in is some really quite complex cost to serve modeling. And there's an awful lot of bits that companies do that actually don't really make them very much money, if any at all, if they really look at it carefully and working out either should we do that, can we do that, and if we do that, how do we do it, and what service do we provide? So I think there's going to be this trend of things narrowing down and much more differential service. I think we've got this B2C trend working through into service expectation, working into the B2B environment. But the reality is you can't afford to do that for everything you make.
Yeah.
Therefore, you've got to be clear who your combination of SKUs and customer, where is it you really make money? Keep them winning. And the bits that kind of towards the tail, find mechanisms for either encouraging them to buy something that you want to make or getting them to work in different ways. And we've got examples of clients where things towards the tail were still held as stocked items, and we moved that from, yeah, of course we'll supply it, but actually we're going to make a year's worth. So you need to take it in this batch size. Yeah, and it's going to be on a 16-week lead time because we're only going to buy the bits when you want it because you're the only one who takes that part. So if you want to do it, you're doing it on our terms, not on yours. Reality is they say, oh, I don't want to do that, I'm going to walk away. Well, actually, you've lost nothing. So, it's so I think it's kind of having that nous about you as well.
Well, and it seems like another one of those benefits of the supply chain mapping we've talked about. You want to understand where your risks are. You want to understand where your costs are. But part of that exercise also has to be understanding where you make your money in the supply chain. Where are the margins? Where are you actually taking on cost and risk for a customer that both doesn't understand and doesn't appreciate it? If somebody has listened to our conversation today and they're either currently going through an exercise to map or remap their supply chain, or they're just thinking about the potential benefits that could come from such an exercise, what would be a piece of advice or a recommendation that you would make?
Think carefully, understand fully before you take any action. And I think I would say I know we focused largely on the kind of modelling aspects, and I think one of the other really key bits of modelling over the coming years is going to be to have a really clear view of what your business is now. So if we accept the premise that the world is just only going to be more volatile, you can't predict all that volatility. But if you understand in a model form what you've got today, you can very quickly understand the implications of that volatility. If, let's say, tariffs are imposed differentially around the world, well, if you got a model that allows you to do that, then you can understand what implication that's going to have on you and your business. And you can very quickly say, if I move this to here, or if I adopted this strategy, how would that impact what I do? So I think my key is, you've got to be able to understand. You've got to understand the implication of rapid and kind of non-linear change, and be able to have a supply chain that is inherently resilient to that, to allow you to subtly move demand patterns around the world and supply from different parts of the world, potentially understanding all your financial, your working capital, and your ecological impact you're having on the world, to allow you to make those decisions. And I think that's the way we keep supply chain strategically important in big businesses.
Well, Tim, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation today, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule, speaking of time, in order to do it. If people have watched or listened in and they would like to connect with you directly, what is the best way for them to find you?
Well, you can find me, Tim Richardson, at Iter Consulting on LinkedIn. There's the Iter Consulting company page on LinkedIn as well. Is probably the easiest way. Either that, or just very boringly through email. tim.richardson@iterconsulting.co.uk. If anyone wants to find me, I'm sure they can, and I really look forward to having those conversations.
Excellent. Tim, thank you so much for being with me.